Mika, it was a fascinating debate, and it was a fascinating debate because the progressives were center stage, and they were actually flanked on the wings by some moderates. There was great give and take. I think any Donald Trump supporter that saw this debate stage might not have as many easy targets moving forward as they did after the last round of Democratic debates, because you actually had some more moderate candidates actually suggesting more of a practical approach, let's say, than an overly utopian approach, which I think a lot of Americans would think when you're talking about giving health care to illegal immigrants and you're talking about giving free education to somebody because they cross the border. I think that's a 80-20 issue. Americans would be against it and think it was too utopian.
And Willie, guys, it seemed, first of all, I thought the debate was really well run, and they got a lot in there, a lot of conversations. I can't wait till we get down to smaller numbers so the conversations can be drawn out more. A little frustrating when they kept having to move on. Who do you think had the standout nights? There were a few candidates who had really great moments.
Yeah, well, I think Miami set up Detroit, and Detroit was a reaction to what happened in Miami. So you had, of all people, we were just talking about this, John Delaney sort of was the leadoff guy, posed as the moderate to go after Elizabeth Warren's plans, to go after Bernie Sanders' plans. And then John Hickenlooper got in. Governor Steve Bullock, in his first debate, he got in talking about wish list economics. This was the pushback of moderates against Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders at the middle of the stage, and a pushback perhaps about some of the concerns that more moderate Democrats have about the direction the party and the direction this primary is heading. We'll see if we see more of that tonight.
But you know what's interesting, Mike Barnicle, is that you did have that give and take. You did have the back and forth, and I think a lot of people have, I can't say they've forgotten, but perhaps it's been pushed to the back of their mind. And maybe we remember it because we talked about it every day, it seemed like, for 2 years, the battle over Obamacare, and the fight, the struggle just to get it to where it was. I think they ended up with 50 votes, and the vice president had to break that vote. But it was the toughest battle. Democrats lost. Let's think about this. Over the next 6 years, Democrats lost 1,000 seats, legislative seats, across the nation after Obamacare passed, in part because of the political fight the Democrats put up with. I mean, as George Bush once said, it's hard, it's hard. And when people are going around throwing around promises, they sound an awful lot like Donald Trump's promises for universal health care, lower very easy to make promises on the campaign stage. Elizabeth Warren said the worst problem we have in Washington, D.C. is corruption. I'd say that Americans probably think the worst problem we have in Washington, D.C. over the past 20, 25 years are broken promises. And God bless Elizabeth Warren and Bernie if they can follow through with what they say. But I wouldn't condemn people for trying to figure out what can we do? What promises can we deliver? Because, again, I hate to keep going on and on about this, but, man, Obamacare was a fight to the political death. And for people to now go, oh, that didn't go far enough. Let's go 10. Let's do 10 times the amount of work. It's not realistic, I don't think.
Yeah, but, Joe, you know, I mean, that gets to the point of the biggest winner last night. And I think a lot of people would think that the biggest winner last night was substance, because they actually discussed health care legislation in some detail. And Elizabeth Warren, she has a grasp of details that she manages to articulate in very short bites, 30 and 60-second bites that resonate, I think, with people. And as far as the biggest problem in Washington, I think it was going to revert to what's going to happen tonight. I think a lot of people, especially Democrats, watching these debates, to them, the biggest problem in Washington is Donald Trump. And I think that's where it'll go tonight. I think last night, there were several people on that stage last night who will disappear from the national stage. But the debate last night, once it got going, after about 20 minutes, it was pretty good. It was pretty educational. A lot of substance. That was kind of impressive.
Well, let's go through it, Mika.
So right off the bat, it was a clash of ideas between lower polling candidates urging incremental change and Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders advocating for a system-wide overhaul. Here are some of the opening statements.
Folks, we have a choice. We can go down the road that Senator Sanders and Senator Warren want to take us, with bad policies like Medicare for all, free everything, and impossible promises that'll turn off independent voters and get Trump reelected.
Last year, Democrats flipped 40 Republican seats in the House, and not one of those 40 Democrats supported the policies of our frontrunners at center stage.
That teacher working a second job just to afford her insulin, they can't wait for revolution.
This isn't about left or right. This is about new and better. I will offer solutions that are bold, that are realistic.
You're going to hear a lot of promises up here, but I'm going to tell you this. Yes, I have bold ideas, but they are grounded in reality.
Our problems didn't start with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is part of a corrupt, rigged system that has helped the wealthy and the well-connected and kicked dirt in the faces of everyone else. We're not going to solve the urgent problems that we face with small ideas and spinelessness. We're going to solve them by being the Democratic Party of big structural change.
By the way, Willie, there's no doubt that you had Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were on fire last night.
Gosh.
And for a primary, for a debate, that is what you want to do. I mean, I'm talking about the mundane mechanics of Washington, D.C., but boy, they were on fire last night.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, I follow up with what Mike said and what you were saying earlier. This was a substantive debate. I mean, whether or not you agreed with what all these candidates were saying, they were articulate, they were well-versed, they're fluent in their policy. And, you know, Elizabeth Warren, you may not agree with her ideas, but boy, does she know them. And John Delaney, you may think if you're a progressive, he doesn't go too far. He's trying to pull you back from big ideas. But he's thought out his ideas, and so have all the people on that stage. So I think it's worth pausing in the last couple of years that have been pretty bereft of policy discussion. It's nice to hear a little of that on stage, John Lemire. It was interesting to hear this sort of progressive, moderate push and pull. There were a lot of Obama Democrats, and in fact, people who worked in the Obama administration last night. Rahm Emanuel put out a memo yesterday admonishing the Democrats on the stage not to repeat what happened in Miami unless they want to lose and hand the election to Donald Trump. David Axelrod, after the debate, back and forth with Elizabeth Warren, kind of pushing her on some of her ideas. That was front and center, that sort of conversation in this party right now about how far left to go.
That's exactly right. That's what that debate was about last night, is sort of where the spirit and soul of the Democratic Party is right now, between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who both were certainly on fire and had very good moments, exchanged very little fire on each other. And that was interesting, that they seemingly, there's a sense they're competing for some of the same voters to consolidate the real progressive wing of the party, but yet they didn't really interact with each other much at all. And when they did, it was to agree. But they then indeed took on fire from more of the moderates, and some were scored points. And at some point, if Elizabeth Warren, let's say, or Bernie Sanders emerges the nominee, some of the attacks that came from fellow Democrats today, you could certainly hear echoed and amplified from Republicans down the road. And I think that this debate about Medicare for all, of course, is one that's going to really shape this Democratic contest in the months ahead. Certainly it'll be more about it tonight. But what's also interesting is what didn't come up last night. Talk about the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court didn't come up last night. Impeachment didn't come up last night. Robert Mueller, who dominated the news cycle last week, didn't come up last night.
Yeah.
Sure.
But Medicare for all, Mika did. Also, the Red Sox continuing to break our hearts. Did not come up last night. The Red Sox bullpen did not come up
about Medicare for all.
There's no debate there, Joe. It's unanimous that they're terrible.
Trading deadline.
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to debate that. This is a critical issue.
No need to debate.
On the Medicare for all, the hospitals will save substantial sums of money because they're not going to be spending a fortune doing billing and the other bureaucratic things that they have to do today. Second of all, maybe you did that and made money off of health care, but our job is to run a nonprofit health care system.
His math is wrong. That's all I'm saying. That his math is wrong. It's been well documented that if all the bills were paid at Medicare rate, which is specifically, I think it's in Section 1200 of their bill, then many hospitals in this country would close.
I think we're being offered a false choice. Some who want to improve the Affordable Care Act at the margins, others who want a Medicare for All program that will force people off of private insurance. I have a better path. Medicare for America. Everyone who's uninsured is enrolled in Medicare tomorrow.
At the end of the day, I'm not going to support any plan that rips away quality health care from individuals. This is an example of wish list economics. It used to be just Republicans who wanted to repeal and replace. Now many Democrats do as well.
Let's be clear about this. We are the Democrats. We are not about trying to take away health care from anyone. That's what the Republicans are trying to do.
Okay, so let's bring in Yamiche, also former Director of Strategic Communications for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Adrian Elrod. You know, Yamiche, it must be interesting for Barack Obama and everybody that fought so hard for Obamacare over the first 2 years of his administration to hear suddenly that their position is a Republican sellout position and that it just doesn't go far enough. I guess that does talk about how far the Democratic Party has come in a few years. But where, from when you go out and you interview people, do people want Obamacare to be mended and not ended? Or do you see a lot of Democrats in the base really wanting to try Medicare for all?
Well, this debate was really about the fault lines running through the Democratic Party. The question is, do voters want someone who's going to be thinking about practical ideas, maybe chasing independent voters who voted for President Trump, but who are now double thinking their idea and thinking maybe they can go with the Democrats? Or do you want a Democrat who has big, progressive, bold ideas, who wants to redo the entire system? When I talk to voters, they're in some ways split on that. They like the idea of building on Obamacare if you're a Democrat, especially if you're someone who was a fan of the president. But then there are people who are saying, look, Obamacare is really expensive. I really want something that's even bigger than that. But most Democrats that I talk to recognize how long it took for Democrats to get health care passed in this country, and they're very worried that they're not sure that if the Republicans hold on to the Senate, that Democrats will be able to change health care in any big ways. That said, I think what's really interesting about last night's debate was this idea that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren almost made this pact, which is that they were going to fight off everyone else and they weren't going to fight each other. I think everyone thought, or at least a lot of people thought, that putting Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on the stage, you were going to get this big food fight, and instead what you got was kind of a real park picnic featuring no plastic straws and a conversation about substance. And that, I think, was very, very interesting because they overlap, and they have those supporters who like Obamacare, but they also have supporters who say, we want Medicare for all, go for it completely.
Yeah, it is interesting, Adrian. There was a split on stage. I'm sure you heard the discussion before, Willie talking about members of the Obama administration taking to task some progressives who suggested that Obamacare was somehow too conservative, didn't go far enough. I don't know about you, but I remember what it was like around Washington in 2009. Yep. That was a pitched battle. Barack Obama pushed Washington, pushed Congress, pushed America as far as he could possibly push them, and barely got Obamacare over the finish line. Now for it to be dismissed as a Republican idea, now for it to be dismissed as too conservative, has to really be galling for Barack Obama and all those who fought to pass Obamacare.
Yeah, Joe, you're exactly right. I was working on Capitol Hill at the time that Obamacare was passed, and I will tell you, it was very, very difficult to get that bill passed. There were lots of deals that were made, lots of concessions to try to get this passed. So the fact that this would now turn into something that people would try to insinuate that this is a Republican type of bill is of course going to anger a lot of Obama administration officials who are instrumental in getting this bill passed. And I think, Joe, you will see this tonight from Joe Biden. I have to think that he watched that debate last night and is thinking, here's a moment where I can really draw a contrast. I also want to say something about what Yamiche just said, which is that the Democratic Party, to an extent, is split in terms of where we should go on health care. That is true, but we've got to start looking forward at the general election and that 4 to 5% of the electorate who is really going to be the ultimate deciders of this election. And I can tell you, I don't think a lot of those folks want to get their private health insurance taken away. I think a lot of them want to fix Obamacare, want to make changes to the system, want to have a more affordable health care, but they don't want to see the system overhauled because they remember how difficult it was to get this passed in the first place.
So, Joe, what'll be interesting tonight as we look ahead, Joe Biden on stage with Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and others, is that the centrist is the man leading the race. So, in other words, last night, the centrists who were pushing back, frankly, were fringe candidates who were polling down low single digits. But the man in the middle of the stage tonight will be the one pushing back against some of these Medicare for all ideas and these progressive concepts. Joe Biden, as we've talked about, will have to have a good performance tonight. He looked rusty the first time out. America will be watching to see how he performs tonight. And again, he will be the moderate at the middle of that stage.
And what a perfect person to have at the middle of that stage. Defending Obamacare.
Yep.
Yamiche, you remember what he whispered to Barack Obama after it passed? Something like, hey, this is a big doggone good deal. Something along those lines. But he was right. That's a guy who'd been around Washington since he was 29 years old. Again, I will say it. The Obama administration pushed Washington and America as far as it could be pushed. There were ugly town hall meetings. Just ask Claire McCaskill. I mean, so Biden, in a sense, seems like the perfect person to be center stage. And either he defends Obamacare or he's overrun by progressives who want to go much, much further.
Well, it's just... I should just say that I've been having conversations with former Obama officials, and they tell me that, yes, of course, Obamacare was hard to get, and they had to drag the country to get that over the finish line. But they also recognize that Obamacare was not something that was ever fully implemented. Democrats always point to the fact that not all 50 states implemented the health care plan in the way that they wanted to see it. So I've been hearing from people who say that was a starting point. We're okay with people building on it. The sad thing is, and the thing that people say is frustrating for them, is when people say, well, we need to pull that out completely and start all over again, because Democrats in the Obama administration recognize how hard that's going to be.
Yeah, so Mika, again, Biden's going to be talking tonight about mending it and not ending it. And again, you look at how difficult that was to pass. It's going to be fascinating. I'd love to hear progressive tonight on stage when they start talking about, oh, no, Obamacare's a sellout. Let's have Medicare for all. I'd like somebody on stage, a progressive tonight, to explain how when Barack Obama had almost a filibuster-proof Democratic Senate, they still just barely were able to push it over the finish line. That's right. They paid a tremendous political price for doing just that.
Still ahead, we're going to hear from a full group of presidential candidates. 5 of last night's 2020 contenders join us here on Morning Joe. Plus, Marianne Williamson's moment on last night's debate stage. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.